Fantastic. Thank you. I want to thank you all for attending and welcome to the webinar today. For those of you who are not familiar with Globalization Partners, we help organizations hire in more than 170 countries without the need of setting up costly international subsidiaries. So you identify the great talent anywhere in the world, and we'll put them on our fully compliant global payroll, basically lifting the burden of all the tax and legal and HR matters on our shoulders from yours. So with that said, we have two exciting panelists with us today who are not only portfolio customers within Insight, but also Globalization Partner customers as well. So I'd like to take a minute to introduce our panelists for today. So Kelly Sheridan is the VP of HR at Bullhorn, and Greg Williamson is the VP of Total Rewards at Fanatics. So welcome to you both.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Thanks, Andrea. Yeah, thanks, Andrea. Appreciate the opportunity.
Fantastic. So we're going to talk a little bit today about global expansion and outline the strategies for how we can make kind of going global easy and less burdensome for people, if you will. So what we've done is we've compiled the top 10 questions that we typically get asked with regards to global expansion. And I thought I would just jump right in and let you all hear from Kelly and Greg's experiences. And so you can learn kind of the success that they've had and also some of the pitfalls, if you will, that they experienced as they were growing internationally. So if I can, I'm going to dive right in. The first question we have is, when making the decision to expand globally, it certainly is a major milestone for any company. And so once they've made that big decision, what would be the first step that you took when going global? And maybe, Kelly, we can start with you on this one.
Sure, be happy to share our experiences. And I've worked with Globalization Partners and global expansion at several different companies, and I find there's a lot of similarities. I think the first thing that we try to decide, and I'm not always involved in the strategic decision about to go global or where to go global, which can be a challenge. But the first thing we want to decide is what kind of employer we want to be in the region. That's really important from a global perspective. Do we plan on being highly competitive? Are we going to be an employer of choice? Are we just getting some bodies in to help with a particular function? And that drives a lot of our decision making in terms of what benefits we offer and what kind of recruiting we do. And then the second thing I do is leverage my amazing global expansion partners. I have several globalization partners is at the top of that list, and talk about how we plan to execute on that strategy.
Excellent. Greg, anything to add there?
No, I mean, I think I would agree with everything Kelly said. I mean, I think that one of the things that we try to do is kind of understand the nature and scope of what we're trying to do outside of the U.S. And it varies for us from country to country. In some cases, we're doing an acquisition, so we're taking on a whole group of people. In other cases, where we might just be hiring someone to sort of manage ethical sourcing requirements that we're subject to. It's kind of a different deal. But on the whole, I would sort of agree with what Kelly said.
Fantastic, excellent. And next question, in terms of, as I mentioned up top, there's always challenges with expanding. So one of the things that I'm hoping to get out of this conversation today is some tips and tricks, if you will, from you guys in terms of what are the challenges you experience, right? So we know that you have to learn new labor laws and make sure you're maintaining local compliance. Could you tell us a little bit more about some of the challenges you experienced during the process of expanding globally? Greg, why don't you give us your feedback?
Yeah, and listen, Andrea, I think you touched on some of them. I mean, there are obviously a lot of things to think about. Some of those considerations are legal in nature. As folks probably know, the employment landscape outside of the U.S. is much, much different than it is here domestically. I mean, maybe the biggest example is here in the United States, at-will employment is kind of the general rule. Outside of the U.S., that doesn't really seem to be a thing, at least in most of the jurisdictions in which we do business. The relationship between employer and employee is mostly contractual in nature. I think Kelly alluded to the notion that you have to try to figure out what kind of employer you're going to be, maybe from a comp and benefits perspective. And navigating the benefits landscape outside of the United States is very challenging sometimes. You gotta be in a position to identify the distinction between statutory benefits that are just required as a matter of law, and then optional benefits, and then even customary benefits, right? I mean, in the United States, for example, there's a lot of sensitivity around healthcare plans. Outside of the United States, in Europe in particular, that sensitivity that you see around health plans domestically is around pension plans. And then again, you can't really sleep on customary benefits. I mean, we found out when we went into Asia, for example, that it is customary to provide senior managers with a driver. So if you want to be market competitive, you can have a great benefit program, but if you're not providing some of these customary benefits that exist in a particular jurisdiction, you're probably not going to get the talent you want.
Yeah, all excellent points in terms of learning how to navigate that landscape. So, Kelly, could you talk a little bit about how did you address some of those challenges? Greg certainly gave us the broad overview of all the scenarios of dealing with benefits and compliance and taxes. What were some of the things that you did to address the challenges that you were facing when navigating a global landscape?
Sure. Definitely the things that Greg mentions are huge and can take a lot of time to sort through. I think I mentioned earlier, I have a couple of great partners that I work with, one in particular that helps guide us on benefits and pensions and brokers and things like that. I think for us, a bigger challenge has been on the cultural side of things. We grew internationally practically overnight. We've had 5 or 6 acquisitions in 18 months and suddenly had offices in all these different countries. And as well, we had a lot of employees who were fairly early in their careers and had only recently stepped into managing people in the US, much less managing people globally. So we found a lot of challenges about how to educate our teams. Things as simple as the fact that in the UK, employees take a month of holiday in August and leave, and work hours and holiday and maternity leave and things like that are much more stringent, and employees tend to disconnect, or language barriers, things like that. So one of the most important things that I've done every time I've done this is institute what I call cultural awareness training, leading and managing in a foreign country. And we do that on both sides. Oftentimes we have taken in employees into the Bullhorn family or the other companies I'm at that have never worked with US employees. So we spend a lot of time educating and helping people understand the cultural gaps. And then I've found personally that another great way to help bridge all of the gaps is to get people on the ground as quickly as possible and encourage them not only to show up and just go to meetings, but to really stay in the offices and get to know people and learn about them and help. It helps speed our ability to understand where we're missing the boat and repair and fix and enhance things as quickly as possible.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. That's fantastic advice. And actually, since we're talking about different areas of the world to expand from APAC to EMEA, I would be interested in your thoughts, both Greg and Kelly, with regards to the differences between expanding into certain parts of the world. So, for example, if someone is tackling to a global expansion in APAC, what are some of the things they should be aware of, and what are those certain things in EMEA they should be aware of? So perhaps, Greg, could you talk a little bit about that and give us some hints there?
No, look, it's a great question, but I got to tell you, from our perspective, the approach is relatively similar. I mean, it's really all about trying to partner with the right folks to learn as much as we possibly can about the jurisdiction that we're going into, because as Kelly sort of alluded to at the outset, many times we are not involved in the early discussions. So if somebody comes to me at some point and says, hey, we're opening up a shop in Indonesia, we need to be there next week. So I think that for us, what we've learned is to sort of get with the right partner organization like Globalization Partners, and at least get a jump on learning as much about as we can about a particular jurisdiction. I mean, obviously there are variances in culture and rules and laws all around the world, But the approach, right, when we were initially going in is very, very similar regardless of where we go.
Great. Kelly, anything to add there?
Yeah, I think I agree with Greg that, there's kind of a formula no matter what country you go in. There's a lot of information you gather and boxes that you check that are very, very similar in terms of how you approach it. I think for us, building trust in those regions is hugely critical. Like I said, my experience has mostly been that we either pick up employees already in those countries or expand. And trying to get on the ground and helping people understand that we really have good intent. But I do agree that the formula is very similar. Learn about the laws, learn about how things are handled, learn about the cultural pieces, make an attempt to get to know people and learn more about how they think and what they do, and keep in constant communication.
So thinking about regulatory compliance and things like GDPR or even more global activity like a Brexit, right? I would wonder, do you guys have any advice on when it comes to learning and adhering to different types of requirements and how you potentially have to move on a dime to manage your EMEA workforce? Kelly, what do you think?
That's a great question. So, I think part of the reason that we continue to work with partners like globalization partners is so we don't have to do that. We rely on smart. We rely on. I can't possibly. I barely can keep track of the laws in the 50 states, much less all of the various countries that we could be expected to practice in. So I think the most critical piece that I have is working with partners who know more than I do. This literally is playing out as we speak. I got news a few weeks ago that we needed to close our entity in Hong Kong and move our people. How are we going to pay them, Kelly? How are we going to keep them employed? And, we'd already had a relationship with GP. I called, and within 2+ weeks, we had the employee transferred under contract. Did a great job of helping her understand what the transition meant. And that was in APAC, where it's really important for people to work for a particular company. So there could have been a lot of fallout. We could have lost the employee, but like you said, I was able to turn on a dime because I had a good partner that I built a relationship with and I was able to leverage that.
Yeah, that's excellent. So
shameless plug for GP, I know.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, Greg, actually, on that note, I would love to hear your feedback on how do you ensure an organization maintains efficiencies as you expand globally? Because all of a sudden, whether it's a carve-out or an M&A activity, or you're taking on new employees from a carve-out, how do you maintain those efficiencies that you perhaps have in the U.S. to a global workforce?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. I think that, and again, from my perspective, there's no real magic to it. It's all about being methodical in the way that you measure things, right? I think that everybody believes, or at least there are certain places where people expand because they think they're going to get some sort of labor arbitrage, and it's going to be more cost effective to do business outside of the U.S. than inside of the U.S. And I think if you measure that stuff carefully, what you will sometimes find is that's not necessarily the case. And so you see some companies that offshore stuff, 6 to 8, 12 months later are onshoring it, bringing it back onshore because they're not getting the kind of lift that they anticipated. So, I think that the key is identifying what the key performance indicators or the key metrics are that are going to define success, and then making sure that you are just absolutely OCD about measuring those things and validating that the hypothesis that supported the decision to go outside of the U.S. was accurate.
Excellent. Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. I think that's one of the things that people struggle with in terms of the global expansion is trying to perhaps take U.S. policies and a U.S. model and try to insert it into another geography. And it's absolutely something that, one, you have to take a look at, set up the correct measurements, and be able to create efficiencies from there. So thank you very much for that, Greg. So as you guys are probably very well aware, not everything always goes perfect. So I would love for you to give the audience just some feedback in terms of, if you had to go back and do your first global expansion, from the beginning, what would you do differently? Kelly, why don't you give us some thoughts?
I can speak to that because I'm living it. So the things that it's really easy to fall prey to is, there's a lot of information in the news and lots of different sources, and people make decisions based on a lot of different things, right? And so it's not unusual to hear we're expanding in a country A because the talent is plentiful and it's cheap and we'll just be able to hire people really quickly. And, before we know it, we're 2 feet into that. And I think one of the things that I would make sure to do differently is really dig deep into that. And find out if the rumors and the news and the perceptions are true. And I have found fabulous success with that, reaching out both to my network and even local companies, or even on LinkedIn, just messaging people who I know have offices, and especially if they're not in my competitive landscape or even in our region, I have found people incredibly willing to talk, and we ask them about their actual experiences in those countries. How is it getting money in and out? I mean, we've had money refused from India several times and weren't able to pay people. How is the hiring? How is the recruiting? Really do your due diligence, talk to as many people as you can, and get the real scoop on how things are before you jump in. Because as Greg mentioned, the laws in that, those are what they are. And you can find good lawyers to help you navigate and plan for that. But it's the perception that's hard to overcome. And if you don't set expectations at the beginning, I find that it's really easy to be perceived as failing on the back end.
Yeah, absolutely. So Greg, what would be the one piece of advice, if you will, you'd give people about your global expansion process?
No, I think, look, first of all, I would agree with everything that Kelly said. And on that note, I think what we try to do now that we didn't necessarily try to do at the beginning is we try to sort of better understand the costs of winding down, right? Because sometimes you do go into a certain jurisdiction, and the rationale for going in doesn't really play out. So you have to figure out how to wind that down and wind it down in a way that is both economically responsible, and to Kelly's point, doesn't create reputational risk to your brand on a go-forward basis. And I think that, and look, in some countries, the process of winding down, both from a legal entity and from an employment perspective, can be really, really costly. So I think, just as part of the process, the more you understand what the downside risks are, and what you might have to do to sort of get out of that, the better positioned you are on the front end to make the decision, and the better positioned you are to plan for those risks as you move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to thank you both so very much, because those cover really the top questions that we typically get, that you guys are living every day. So I want to thank you and Insight Venture Partners for hosting the webinar. We look forward to continuing to work closely with all of you to help you solve your challenges around global expansion. I would encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about Globalization Partners, you can find us on the Go Network, and you can reach out to Kevin Burke, whose information will be coming up shortly. So Christina, with that said, I'm going to send it over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. What a great conversation. So for all of those attendees, please feel free to enter your questions in the control panel now. I'm excited that a few have already came in. So the first one is, what is the average time it takes to hire internationally?
Oh,
I'm happy to. Sorry.
Go ahead. I'm laughing because I wish there was an average time, right?
Yeah. I wish I knew that. Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. There's two things to really consider when hiring globally. First, markets are hot all over the world. As I mentioned earlier, don't fall prey to the people are plentiful in X country. So we're seeing similar similar times to hire. What actually is more difficult to manage around is notice periods. So in the US, it's a 2-week notice period, but in most countries, it can be 90 days or more. So while you may hire in the same amount of time it takes you to hire in the US, onboarding them is a very different scenario. And we're also seeing, because of the hot markets, that people similar to in the US are not showing up. They're using our offers to get better offers. So staying in constant contact once you've made a hire is equally critical.
Yeah, this is Greg. I don't really have anything to add to that. That's exactly our experience.
Yeah.
Great. That was wonderful. Next question. When starting a new team in any department in a new region, do you think it's more important to hire the manager first or the staff?
Greg, what do you think? Yeah.
Kelly took the last one, so I'll take this one. Look, from my perspective, and I think this holds true regardless of where you're talking about, whether it's domestically or outside of the U.S. I have a bias in favor of hiring the leadership first, and the rationale, from my perspective, is at some point that leader is going to be held accountable for the actions of his or her staff, right? So I want that person to have a role in picking the team that is going to be sort of responsible for that person's success or failure. And I don't think, from my perspective, it doesn't matter whether I'm talking about inside the U.S. or outside of the U.S.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah, and I would agree. This is Andrea. I mean, I think we not only help companies do this, but we do this ourselves. So I have a team all over the world, and one of the things I always look for is I find the leader first for a couple of reasons. One, they need to set the tone and provide some guidance as to the culture and the nuances of the location that they're in. And secondly, I always look for somebody that has a bit of an entrepreneurial kind of spirit and energy about them, because they perhaps will be the first one in a location, and so they really have to take on the ability to grow the team, perhaps play a little bit of a different role than they would if they were here in the U.S. So I too look for the leadership roles.
Great. I agree with that. Although if you can swing bringing in a leader and a couple of teammates at the same time, not a bad way to play it either. Like all on day. Well, there's, especially if you're building a team, there's some camaraderie with that. And listen, we hire single people in other countries. I think, to Greg's point, either way, the most important thing is getting them integrated into the global leadership structure as quickly as possible and making sure that they have people who are taking incredible care of them in the wider organization.
Great. Awesome. So we have another question that came in. Any advice for companies to navigate cultural nuances when expanding globally?
I'd be happy to speak to that. I've done a lot of work there. So first and foremost, I will make a plug for the HR professionals on this call. If you ever have an opportunity to take an assignment, even short term, in another country, I say go for it. It's a fabulous way to understand the challenges that will play out and help you navigate them when you do expand, even if it's a month. I did a stint in China for 4 months, and it was life-changing. But I think the most important thing is to have experts at your disposal. Again, I work with the team at Globalization Partners, and I also work with a group that does nothing but cultural awareness training. They operate similar to GP all over the globe. They will deliver one-on-one personal training or all the way up to group training online to people who are moving to another country, people who will be working in the US with people in other countries. And we spend a lot of time training, discussing, sending people over to the countries to help navigate those nuances. People fall prey to the fact that because, say, English is spoken in the UK, and my UK friends will argue that they if you speak American English, it is not the same language and it is not the same business practices. And the quicker you can educate all of the different people involved in that as to the differences and how to be respectful and mindful of them, the more successful you'll be.
Yeah, this is Greg again. I don't have anything to add to that. I mean, I think, Kelly is spot on. I mean, you cannot ignore the cultural differences. And in fact, to the degree that you can embrace them and use them to your advantage, it makes the whole organization stronger. And the way to do that is through training.
Really helpful insight. If anyone else has a question, please feel free to enter that now, and we'll give you 30 seconds. Otherwise, we'll wrap up. Any final words from the panelists?
This is Andrea. Just, hey, good luck. It's a great experience. It will enrich your teams. It'll enrich your business to expand overseas and embrace those cultures. So any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to any of us on the phone today.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you both.
You're welcome.
Continue.
I was just going to say the global expansion is fantastic. So if I can be of help to anyone, I'm happy to talk.
Yeah, likewise. It's a lot of fun. I mean, there are a lot of headaches, but on balance, I've had more fun in this role than any other role that I've ever had.
Well, with that, that concludes the webinar for today. As a reminder, I will be sending out the recording as well as the presentation by the end of the day, so keep a lookout for that. And all portfolio company executives, please feel free to log on to Insight's community platform to start a discussion and leverage a special offering from Globalization Partners. Until next time, thank you, everyone.